Good evening, everybody. My name is Michael Collins. Welcome to William Penn University and our Leaders Speak series. This evening's presentation, which is the last in this year's series, is supported by Humanities Iowa, a private nonprofit state affiliate of the National Endowment of the Humanities. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Debra DeLaet. Dr. DeLaet received her BA in political science from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and obtained both her Master of Arts and PhD, also in political science, from the University of Notre Dame. She currently is a professor of political science at Drake University, where she has been awarded the David E. Maxwell Distinguished Professor of International Affairs. Her major research interests are in the areas of human rights, global health, and gender issues in world politics, topics on which she's published a plethora of professional articles and has written several books. Tonight, she will help us to conceptualize and explore human rights in the everyday. And it's my pleasure to welcome, and please join me in welcoming, Dr. Debra DeLaet.
So thanks to everyone for being here. I hope you can hear me. I'm delighted to be here tonight to talk about universal human rights in the everyday. I see a couple of faces of people who were at a human rights research conference on Saturday at the University of Iowa. So I'm really pleased to be here to continue that conversation with a broader audience. December 10th, 2018, was the 70th anniversary of the General Assembly's adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so I think this is a really important time to stop, take stock, and think about what has been accomplished in advancing human rights since the General Assembly adopted this document 70 years ago. Now, I'm going to focus on the UDHR as a lens to think about how we advance human rights, but I really will be talking about my sense that human rights are most likely to be promoted, implemented, and achieved when we integrate them into our everyday professional and personal lives than when we expect a distant global institution to do all of the work for us. So we'll use the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to think through some of what I mean by this idea. And perhaps we'll have slides. We'll be patient. There's not that many, and they're not text heavy, but it's perhaps worth doing. If not, I can just speak.
You can just speak, I'll see that.
Okay, so the next image is a slide of the UDHR, and it's just listing all of the rights. But what is really important to know about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if you don't already know it, is that it's a boldly idealistic and aspirational document. So bold and aspirational that a lot of people might believe that it's not possible to achieve the rights that are articulated therein. Its preamble recognizes the inherent dignity, equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. The preamble identifies these rights to be even more ambitious as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Try again?
Sure.
Oh, it's working. Excellent. So this is René Cassin's portico of human rights that lays out the sort of categories of rights in the document, and it helps us to think through the broad range of rights that we see in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the UDHR articulates 30 rights, and you can see from this portico we have rights in different categories: life, liberty, and personal security rights, rights in civil society, rights in the polity, economic, social, and cultural rights. So the full span of human rights. But what is notable, and remember this point because we'll contrast it to some of the later approaches to trying to advance human rights in the legal covenants on human rights. But here, 30 articles and the full span of rights across categories. It's really ambitious, really broad, and quite an accomplishment that the international community was able to agree on this declaration spanning so many rights in so many different categories. So if you study human rights, even a little, you likely have heard the critique, and it's one worth taking seriously, although I'm about to push back against it. But you've likely heard the critique that human rights are biased because they're Western in origin and nature. And it's pretty important to be cautious about making really sweeping universal claims without taking into account the diversity of perspectives across the globe. At the same time, the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights emphatically shows that the UDHR was not strictly or exclusively Western in origin. So the Commission on Human Rights had representation from all regions of the world. And not only did it have representation of governments from all regions of the world, but it sought input and ideas from many, many actors well beyond national governments. So there was a survey of philosophers. They sought input about rights in different cultures from novelists, from poets, from community activists, from non-governmental organizations. So the input for this document was incredibly broad, both in terms of geography, ideology, professional background, and so on. And despite this breadth of perspective, the international community was still able to adopt a document that included the full span of rights. It includes rights to life, prohibitions against slavery and torture, rights to privacy, freedom of movement, nationality, freedom of religion, and freedom of conscience. The document further articulates rights to Social Security, work, education, and a standard of living adequate to health. So as we'll see as I move forward in my remarks, this sort of universality and breadth of the UDHR's claims is both its strength and its weakness. So some of what is best about the document is also some of what hinders its ability to be realized and implemented in practice even 70 years after its passage. Before I start digging into some of the critiques and the obstacles to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I also want to just say again what an incredible achievement it was for this document to be passed. My assumption is that everybody in here, whether or not you have a lot of familiarity with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is familiar with the term human rights. And that would not be the case if it weren't for this document. The language of human rights did not exist as a universal discourse or as a global discourse prior to the UDHR. We can look at different histories in different countries and trace back the lineage of rights talk and rights language in the European Enlightenment, for example. Or we can look at connections between concepts of tolerance in a lot of different cultures and religions. But human rights, as an idea of something that belongs to every person, everywhere, did not exist prior to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the fact that we now live in a space where I can assume without having to ask everybody to raise your hand, although I suppose I could do so, have you heard of this notion of human rights before? I just know most people have. That would not be the case without the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think it's really important to take a moment just to reflect on how important that really is. Because if you don't have a language of human rights, you can't effectively act on human rights. So even though I am going to dig into some of the limitations of this document as we go forward, I just want to start with that really, really important fact. So here come some of the limitations, however. Even though it's incredibly important that we have a global discourse of human rights, largely due to the work begun with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, does not create codified binding legal norms. And this document does not create mechanisms for enforcing those legal norms. So it's incredibly aspirational. It gives us a language to talk about something that we might not be able to talk about absent human rights discourse, but it doesn't create the institutions or the mechanisms for pushing human rights forward. So, as religion scholar Jenna Reinbold has argued, the Declaration, which is a non-binding statement of global norms, demonstrates what she calls the extrajudicial logic of many legal documents. And here, I'm going to say this next thing twice. The purpose of the UDHR is actually to create the very rights that it is articulating already belong to people. The purpose of the document is to create the rights that it's claiming already exist. So that's really, really important to think about what the political and cultural meaning of the UDHR really is. All humans have the right to life. All humans have the right to move. That's asserted as a fact, but it doesn't describe reality clearly. So it's an assertion of fact as aspiration. That's important to this notion that I'm going to be building, that the way to achieve rights is to explicitly acknowledge that part of it, that we have to work to create rights, not just take them for granted because we can point to a piece of paper that says they exist when they don't get respected across the board or across the world in practice. So we can reflect on the limitations of a largely aspirational document that's about language by just looking at the world that we live in. Think about all of the atrocities that have been committed in Syria, Congo, Sudan, Somalia. Think about the fact that we are living through a period where there's an ongoing genocide in Myanmar. Think about the fact that 7 million children die every year from preventable illnesses. So when I could go on and on and on about the bleak statistics and the bleak reality, and if we think about that reality juxtaposed against this really beautiful and aspirational language of the Universal Declaration, it can be hard not to lose heart. And it can be challenging not to sort of be tempted to say, well, this international law clearly doesn't matter because it hasn't produced the change that it strives to produce. 70 years later, we still see many of the human rights atrocities that the Declaration was meant to eliminate. So that's one of the puzzles that I want to talk about tonight. Before I do that, I want to start with maybe a swing back to more positive things again and talk about global public opinion and human rights, because I think some of the figures on global support for human rights support critics of international, or surprise critics of international human rights law, because I think the temptation again is to say you've got this aspirational discourse and you've got the reality of human rights abuses. And it's easy for those who doubt the power of international law or its value to appear to have won the argument. But if you remember that the concept of human rights discourse did not exist globally prior to the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the data on global public opinion is really compelling. So I'm going to give you an overview of some of this. So again, one of the singularly most important and lasting contributions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was to constitute a language of human rights. And we went from living in a world in the immediate aftermath of World War II, where you didn't have widespread language, we're just reckoning with the reality of the Holocaust, to these figures many years later that show that not only do people recognize human rights, but they widely support them across the regions of the world. So in 2011, the Council on Foreign Relations, International Relations, and Global Governance program conducted a comprehensive survey of international and U.S. polling to compile a digest of key findings that show majority support in countries across the globe for the following rights: freedom of expression, including criticism of government, the right to demonstrate peacefully, the right to a free press, equal treatment under the law without distinctions based on religion, gender, race, or ethnicity, rights to basic needs for food, health care, and education, free elections and universal suffrage. And I think one of the most important findings from the survey in terms of tonight's talk is that large majorities in all countries, on average 70% of those polled, believe that the United Nations should make efforts to promote the human rights that are recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that was from 2011. More recent polling data reaffirms the widespread global support for human rights. So the figures that I have here are largely from a Ipsos poll, a Canadian polling agency from just last summer, July 2018, because I'm anticipating the questions already. Well, yeah, that was 2011, but we have this wave of anti-rights populism across the globe. These figures are recent. Key findings include 73% of the world's adult populations believes there is such a thing as human rights. Globally, almost 8 in 10 people surveyed stressed the importance of having laws that protect human rights, and more than half of those surveyed said that human rights make their lives better. A strong majority of people, 70%, recognize that human rights violations are a problem in their own country. In other words, this isn't just a view where it's easy to say, yeah, I believe in human rights, but we're fine. My country is fine. Most people recognize that their own governments have weaknesses and problems in the area of human rights. Now, here's where things get a little interesting. 4 in 10 people admit they know little or nothing about human rights. So they believe in them even if they don't know a great deal about their content, and that might perhaps help us understand the gap between the idea of rights and belief in rights and the reality of rights violations across the globe. A majority of those surveyed are aware of the human rights work of organizations like the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, Amnesty International, Human Rights Work. 51% in this poll believe the UN is doing good work to promote human rights. More than 50% of the world's citizens, and this contrasts a little bit or pushes a little bit against the other point that I raised, 50% say they know a great deal or a fair amount about human rights. Now, polling in specific countries varies a great deal, and that inevitably shows how national culture and politics shape human rights views. But it's just very striking and important to begin, I think, with this perhaps surprising data that shows how broad and widespread support for human rights is across the globe. We can zoom in on the context of the United States to show that U.S. citizens share strong support for human rights. So there was a Harris poll that was, I think, just a couple of years old that shows U.S. voters from across the political spectrum favor stronger U.S. leadership on key human rights issues, including the elimination of hate crimes, 59% of those polled in the Harris poll, and human trafficking, 56% of those polled. 82% of U.S. citizens want companies to be held accountable for slavery and human trafficking in their supply chains, and more than 80% of U.S. citizens in that poll say that businesses should not be able to deny services based on race, ethnicity, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, or disability. So when we recall that the language of human rights did not exist prior to World War II in any meaningful way, these figures, again, are really striking. Now, we need to note that belief in the idea of human rights does not translate, obviously, into concrete actions in any sort of ready sense. And so that's the next part of the puzzle that I want to think about. And here, looking at the lens of the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is helpful. So this is a political cartoon from 1947. Oops. There, sorry, I went too far ahead. This was before the UDHR was adopted by the General Assembly. And it depicts delegates at a meeting of the UN Human Rights Commission as unruly school children. So it's Eleanor Roosevelt lecturing the commission delegates from various countries. Now, children, she says, altogether, the rights of the individual are above the rights of the state. At the lower left, you have John Foster Dulles, an American delegate, who's aiming a slingshot at the Soviet ambassador to the UN, Andrei Vyshinsky, who stands in the lower right corner wearing a dunce cap. Charles Malik of Lebanon offers the teacher an apple. Several delegates seem bored, others are attentive. So I wanted to share this cartoon because it captures the contentious politics that are inevitably involved when you have governments from diverse countries, diverse cultures, diverse ideological systems trying to come up with a consensus document around universal human rights. It was political then, it's political now. And even if you can get people to agree on the ideas in the abstract, the politics are complicated and the politics are messy. So, going back to the point that I made at the beginning about the fact that this is not the West versus the rest, with the West being fully in support of human rights and non-Western countries being oppositional. Vastly more complicated than that, and a lot of the disagreement is more within countries and within systems than between them. So there was a Bengali Muslim poet and philosopher, Humayun Kabir, who suggested that the fundamental flaw in human rights at the time that the debate over the Universal Declaration of Rights was being created was not their claimed universality, but the failure to live up to this universality. And in practice, his critique was that the aspirational language of universal human rights was only really applied to a European context and not widely, especially given that we know that colonialism was still deeply embedded in parts of the world at that time. So if there was a division between the West and the rest, it wasn't in belief for those aspirational norms, it was disparities in access to those universal human rights. And so listening to the voices of some of the non-Western people who participated in the process is really important. Likewise, Hansa Mehta, who is an Indian representative on the drafting committee, is the person, more than Eleanor Roosevelt, who I love and who deserves enormous credit, obviously, for her role in helping to move the Universal Declaration of Human Rights forward. But the mistake is sometimes to see Eleanor Roosevelt as the main person or the only person involved. Instead, this woman, Indian delegate, Hansa Mehta, was absolutely critical in the fact that inclusive language was adopted through much of the document. She was fighting against gender inequities in India, and she argued in opposition to Eleanor Roosevelt that it shouldn't use the phrase throughout of all men, but should instead talk about persons, the human family. Eleanor Roosevelt's argument at the time was that all men meant everybody, but Mehta argued that we should have more inclusive language that didn't signal in any way that there was ambiguity on this point. So as that example shows, the drafting process was inclusive, shaped in important ways by delegates from across the world. In the end, those delegates representing diverse cultures, diverse political systems, diverse ideologies came together and made compromises that made consensus possible. But it's also those compromises that ultimately limited the effectiveness of the document to move beyond aspiration to implementation. So one of the biggest points, when you go back, I read a bunch of history this year just because I've been fascinated by the history of human rights. And one of the debates that it wasn't that they didn't think about it, they explicitly dealt with the tension of should we just leave the language aspirational or do we need it to be more concrete? And delegates representing the legal profession cautioned again and again that if you didn't have concrete legal language, it was going to merely be an aspirational document. But on the other side, people said if we push too hard for concrete legal language, we're not going to get universal consensus. So consensus was born on the compromise of treating the document as aspirational and not trying to make it hyper-legalistic and enforceable from the moment of its creation. Now, I want just a really quick background to throw in. That compromise made widespread support possible. The Human Rights Commission that crafted the document voted 13-0 in favor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with 4 abstentions. And when the document went to the General Assembly, there were 48 votes in favor, 0 against, and 8 abstentions. And that widespread support is a product of compromise and limiting the enforcement mechanisms that were embedded in the document. So here we are. I've cited some of the statistics. The debate and the problem at the time of the document's creation remains with us. We have a document that's largely aspirational still and linguistic, and we could cite for the rest of our time all of the human rights atrocities that occur in countries across the globe. So one might be tempted to say that the people that wanted concrete legal mechanisms in the UDHR were right, but I think they were wrong. Because in between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and now, we have had many, many, many binding legal documents created. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that takes the civil rights aspects of the UDHR and codifies them as law. We have the same thing in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights for economic, social, and cultural rights. We have a torture convention. We have a refugee convention. We have a convention on the rights of the child, a convention on the elimination of discrimination against women, a convention on the elimination of racial discrimination. All of those treaties, which are binding and legal and juridical, have not done any more to push human rights forward than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has. That's frustrating. Why is that? I think some of this I would like to take up in the question and answer period because I want to make sure I talk a little bit about how my own thinking has shifted. So it used to be when I first started teaching my course on human rights that I was really on the critical side, that I loved the aspirational language, I loved the ideals that the UDHR stands for, and all of the subsequent human rights treaties that have been passed. And I felt like again and again and again, as I was teaching my students about human rights, I was banging up into this wall that you had to acknowledge the reality. You couldn't present this rosy picture where you have this beautiful language and these critical rights, and then the reality that human rights abuses continue on a systemic way across the globe. My students would feel depressed. They would risk leaving the class thinking that international law was irrelevant if all it was words and words on paper. And I realized that I think my own thinking for a long, long time was too narrow, was judging legal rights from a sort of political science law framework that assumed that that's what it meant, that law is law is law. But if we return to the religion scholar Jenna Reinbold and think about this as language that is a call towards creating the things that it is claiming, it shifts responsibility for implementing rights. Instead of saying, well, we have the international human rights law, it's binding, the UN should deal with this. That's a naive understanding of how the UN works, and we can dig into that a little bit in the question and answer period. But it also sort of assumes that we're powerless to all of this. And so I've kind of returned full circle back to a place where the UDHR as an aspirational document may be our only hope. By really making explicit that we are talking about aspirations and we have to work to make those rights claims reality. We can't just say, we've achieved this on paper, now we can all go home. And so I turn to a very famous comment that Eleanor Roosevelt made in 1958 at the General Assembly in celebration of the 10th anniversary of the UDHR. And this is what she says. This quotation has been an obsession of mine for the last year or two. And the more I read it, the more it sort of shifted my thinking about how we try to move the needle on human rights if that's what we believe should happen. So she says, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. So what has started to happen to my own thinking about human rights in the last couple of years, I teach about human rights. Of course I teach about international human rights law. I'm an international relations scholar and a political scientist. I have to. But I believe increasingly that I would be derelict in my duty if I let the conversation stop there. Here's the law. Isn't it wonderful that we have these rights? But here's the limitations. There aren't enforcement mechanisms. There's loopholes. There's ambivalent language. Oh, well, I guess international law doesn't work. I think that's a dereliction of duty. So I'm returning back to this space where we're looking at not human rights as something that's achieved in a distant space just because there are rights on paper, but what do we have to do? What can we do to advance human rights in our own communities, in our own professional work? And so I'll really briefly highlight a few examples. One of the research papers that I've been working on recently, it's ongoing, is called Promoting Human Rights to the Health Professions. There's a huge debate amongst a lot of scholars of global health and international relations about whether or not we need a framework convention on the right to health. And in a different piece, I wrote unequivocally that that's not where we should be putting our time, money, and energy. There's already a right to health. There's already a human right to health. It matters. It's important that we have that language. But we're spinning our wheels if we think we're going to perfect it by one more treaty. There will still be loopholes. There will still be ambivalent language, and it will still be hard to get enforcement mechanisms in a world where states disagree. Think of that cartoon. So instead, I'm working with a physician. Her name is Holly Atkinson, and she's the past president of Physicians for Human Rights. I'm also working with a former student who's getting a JD and an MD and wants to integrate human rights work into her future medical practice. And to say, we aspire to the human right to health, but we can't rely exclusively on the law to achieve it. So how do physicians and other health professionals advance human rights in their own work? Dr. Atkinson has created an entire human rights curriculum for students at Mount Sinai at med school, where she trains them how to engage in advocacy, how to lobby state legislators, how to write grants that they can use for human rights work in their community. So changing the way you train physicians. It's not just about biomedicine. It's about the socio-cultural context, and you won't achieve a right to health if doctors focus narrowly on biomedicine and wait for the lawyers to fix the problem. Physicians have to change the way they do their work. Health professionals have to change the way they do their work. I'm working on another paper about this concept of therapeutic justice. Rather than waiting for the International Criminal Court, which is a major achievement in international law, but is able to handle just the smallest number of cases, talking about the ways that social workers and psychologists can work with survivors of human rights atrocities that live in their own communities. And survivors of human rights atrocity live in every community, and how they can engage in empowering survivors to pursue healing and as a form of justice. So thinking about the work that social workers can do to promote human rights. Psychologists being trained about human rights and knowing that if they're going to cooperate with coercive interrogation techniques that constitute torture, psychologists need to be trained about the ethics of human rights and the kind of work that they should and should not do. Human rights educators, how do we teach in our classrooms, K-12, college, and beyond? And if we confront the issue of structural racism, you don't wait for the law to change that. You change the curriculum. You change the way you engage in schools. So human rights in the everyday, that the rights exist, they are there, and it's up to us to figure out ways to move towards the realization of those rights, not to wait for international organizations that are very, very distant to come up with a solution that's not likely to arrive. Another example, what I call the politics of decency. So there was a book by a man named Bo Lidegaard, Countryman, and Michael Ignatieff wrote a review of this book. And in this book, this is what he wrote. It's a book about how many Danish Jews survived the Holocaust. This magnificent book states its central argument in its title. Danish Jews survived when other European Jews did not, because Danish people regarded their Jewish neighbors as countrymen. There was no us and them, just us. When in October 1943, the Gestapo came to round up the 7,500 Jews of Copenhagen, the Danish police wouldn't help them smash down the doors. The churches read letters of protest to their congregations. Neighbors helped families to flee the villages on the Baltic coast. Local people gave them shelter in churches, basements, and holiday houses, and local fishermen loaded up their boats and landed them safely in neutral Sweden. Everyday citizens made the choice to pursue a politics of decency and to treat their neighbors who were under threat of genocide as countrymen that they wanted to protect, whatever the law said. It wasn't about waiting for some external actor to come save them. It was about doing the work themselves. I'm going to be participating in a Rwandan Genocide commemoration. There's a really famous political science study about Rwanda. And we talk about the 800,000 people that were killed in the span of 100 days there. But one of the interesting political science findings in the aftermath of this was that the rates of killing were not uniform across the country. The rates of killing varied in different political districts. And what was one of the most critical predictors of whether or not there were high rates of genocidal killing or low to none? It was the role and presence of moderate civic leaders in those communities that were willing to stand up and engage in a politics of decency and to fight extremism, even if it meant sometimes they were at risk of violence themselves. So, I'm going to return to religion scholar Jenna Reinbold, Seeing the Myth in Human Rights. The social scientist in me might have been resistant at one point in my career to the importance of the myth-making role of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, we social scientists are trained in empiricism and maybe a little bit dismissive of the notion of myths as something important. More and more, I am inclined to find my only hope there. It places the onus on creating a right in which the language of human rights translates into action, in which the idea of human rights has substantive meaning to all of us, not just the lawyers, not just the policymakers, not just the politicians, and maybe especially not the latter. As I say in my human rights class at Drake, hope about human rights is a choice and not a reflection of reality. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a foundational document in the discourse of human rights and in human rights myth-making. The polling data that I discussed at the beginning of the talk demonstrates the growing resonance of the language of human rights and the potential power of the human rights myth to take root. It's up to us to make it so. Thank you. So we have time, I think, for some questions and answers. And there'll be a mic circulating. I think they want people to use the mic when you're asking your question. So, does anybody have any questions, reactions? I'll be patient in case people are reserved and shy.
First, hello. Well, yeah, thank you. That was very informative. I have a question, but unfortunately, it's aimed at a little different direction, I think, than where you were going, but really fascinated by this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and always have been. And I've never read a whole lot about any of the empirical research that's been done with this. So I'm curious, from kind of a pure as opposed to more of an applied point of view or perspective, has anybody ever treated these human rights as an ideal type? And if so, has anyone sort of quantified a scale, say, of a human rights score sort of thing, composite measure, wherein you can, apply this in a meaningful way to, if not different countries across the same period of time, different regions of a country or some such thing?
Yeah, I actually heard two questions in that, I think. So the first one is just, is there data on sort of indexing human rights performance? And there are places that you can look to sort of see how countries fare in measuring up to human rights, a political freedom index. U.S. State Department puts out a human rights report every year. The United Nations Development Program, if you look at their human development reports, by the way, I encourage all of the students, if you haven't already done this, the UNDP is an amazing source of data, country to country, on development, but you can go in and look at gender equality. So it's not always rights per se, but indicators that are correlated with rights. So there's lots of that, I think. The challenge is, what do we do with that? So I'm not sure it gets us around the dilemma of there's still a gap between rhetoric and reality and rights. And so I think it's important that we do that, but it doesn't necessarily move the needle more in terms of, getting states to achieve progress on human rights. The second question, and here I will return to my social science roots. Humanities, social sciences all have incredibly valuable things to say. So I'm not dismissing or dissing the social sciences tonight in focusing on the sort of mythic aspect of human rights. In fact, I think some of the more interesting work that has pointed me in the direction of really focusing on aspiration is in the empirical work that's been done on human rights. So there have been correlative studies done. Now, one of the problems is, and I don't know who among you are social scientists, methodology matters. And I am not a quantitative scholar, but I read quantitative work. And there's different quantitative scholars that have come to differing conclusions. So there's a scholar who I believe is from Harvard, her name's Beth Simmons, who has found some degree of correlation between participation in human rights treaties and improved outcomes. There's another scholar named Emily Hafner Burton, she might be from USC, who in fact finds that the reverse is sometimes true. So this is one of the counterintuitive findings that we can get out of social science work. There's been at least one other piece about how participation in the torture treaty can be correlated inversely with the use of torture. Now there's a puzzle to figure out. The hypothesis is that some states sign on for legitimacy gains have no intention of upholding the norms, and in fact have cover for perpetrating torture because they can say, but we're a member of the torture convention. And so because there aren't strong enforcement mechanisms, there's nothing really to do. So yes, there are correlative studies, but they do not provide us with comprehensive, solid answers. There's sort of conflicting information. And given that I do more comparative work, I think a lot of the comparative studies align with some of the correlative studies that suggest there's a tenuous relationship at best between participation in human rights treaties and actual enforcement. A lot of the countries, if you do sort of case studies or comparative work, the countries that are most likely to participate in the admittedly weak bodies for enforcement and monitoring are those countries that already have relatively strong human rights records. So you're more likely to see participation in sort of monitoring and preliminary enforcement efforts in Scandinavia, some European countries. But in the countries that perhaps are most in need of human rights improvements, they're less likely to participate, or if they participate, they're likely to flout the laws. So.
Very interesting, thank you. Other questions?
Wouldn't abortions go against human rights, specifically the right to life?
Well, certainly, lots of people believe that, and so that example is a really good example for illustrating one of the reasons that we can have a situation where you have 73% of the people in a country, let's say, that say they believe in human rights, but then in practice not have agreement on what that means. So, are there human rights activists and organizations that believe that abortion is a fundamental violation of the human right to life? Absolutely and unequivocally so. Are there actors and organizations and human rights activists that see the problem entirely differently and frame it as the right to a woman's healthy life? Absolutely. And so that example, I mean, I'd prefer not to weigh in or even take a side on this. I think the point here is to acknowledge that example as one of the kinds of sticking points when you get, the devil is in the details. So there's a right to life, but what does that mean? And that's the interpretation of what the right to life means varies culturally, religiously, across countries, within countries. And so I think that example helps us to see and understand why we can have really broad, widespread universal support for human rights as an ideal, but get stuck in practice. And we can probably think of other examples too. Yeah.
Other questions?
I think there was one.
Yes.
Hi, Kurt Crocker, student. Thank you for your time. So you say that that you should change your mindset in order to change the way that the Declaration of Human Rights is. So of course we live in a class system. You get what you pay for. So for example, use professors or teachers, for example. What do you do when students don't have the necessary needs like books, or they have kids that come to school sleep deprived, are hungry? How do you educate those students when you have scenarios like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so my answer, and I'll tell you some of what I do at Drake, I view that as an example of what I'm talking about, human rights in the everyday. So let's say we're talking about the right on paper, the right to education. Everybody has a right to education. We can fine print. It's a little small to read, but it's in there, right to education. It's not just an aspiration. There's a binding right to education in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So this is a perfect example. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights doesn't say there's a right to education. By virtue of that right, all students everywhere shall have access to adequate food and nutrition, and shall have access to books so that they can actually realize their rights. So it's another example of where the law doesn't specify the detail and doesn't create concrete obligations. Now, I think it's also an example of why we'll be waiting a long time if we wait for the government to provide those rights, even if I might wish it to be so. So this is an example. I don't know what goes on around this issue at William Penn. I know at Drake, there are a lot of us who see the right to education as a human right and see the obstacles in our community, and we're doing work, hard work, slow work, but trying to operationalize the right to education. So what I think should happen at Drake, it's my immediate community, a group of us started a scholarship fund for students from underrepresented groups with demonstrated financial need. It's a start, it's a drop in the bucket. We don't have enough money, but we are both donating and working on raising money so that we can provide scholarships, emergency funds, and so on to address some of the problems you're talking about. Another set of faculty and staff are working on big ideas to try to get grant support. I think there should be a food pantry. Students can't learn if they're hungry. And just last week, we received a request from a student who may not graduate because they're trying to decide, do I pay rent, food for the next 2 weeks, my graduation cap and gown? That's not the right to education in practice. And so I would cite that again as an example where I think institutions of higher education across the country, across the world, should be working on these issues.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. It seems like being in a Western democracy here, we probably have this notion that human rights violations occur more so in authoritarian regimes. Have you found instances where the grassroots human rights changes that you are promoting have actually been birthed within nations that have authoritarian regimes rather than here at home or in democratic nations?
Yeah, there's again a vast and complicated scholarly literature on the, and people disagree. Some people think humanitarian intervention is the way to go in cases of, say, genocide. We could talk about South Africa and the end of apartheid and know that the leadership of Nelson Mandela and others was absolutely critical. We also know that this is not just nonviolent resistance, that we can have discussions about what role does violent resistance versus nonviolent resistance have in context of authoritarian tyranny and violence. I think the argument I'm making is maybe less about those sort of extreme systematic gross violations of human rights and more the human rights violations we see every day, everywhere, which is not to rank order or prioritize, but my own sense of this is that change is most effective and most likely when it is grassroots. So I can give you a few examples, at least one. So I always think about this example, which is historic, but foot binding in China. There's a lot of global critique around that practice, but it gradually ended. And it's fascinating how it ended, even though there were external critiques as well, is you basically had family associations where groups of parents came together and made pledges. So the parents of girls would say, we are not allowing our daughters to have their feet bound, even though that feet binding practice was a path to marriage and economic support. The mothers agreed to sign these pledges, and the parents of daughters and the parents of sons came together and signed pledges to say, we will not allow our sons to marry women who have had their feet bound. That's a pretty profound example of a grassroots change. I think there's a lot of research on female genital cutting practices that show that change is more likely to occur and to succeed when you work at the grassroots, and if not fully led by local community members, they're in partnership. So that's exactly the kind of change that I am calling for. I think change is most likely when we focus on our own communities and see what we can do in grassroots organizations, but even just as citizens, politics of decency, rethinking how we see the world around us. So that doesn't mean, this isn't a call, in my mind, of isolationism and only look inward. We should care that there's a genocide going on in Myanmar. We should care about femicide in Central America that's driving so much of the migration to the U.S. southern border. We should be thinking about interconnections and global dynamics and gross violations of human rights in other parts of the world, but we are often best positioned to act locally. And best positioned to act locally also minimizes the risk that we are culturally ignorant and promote practices that might have unintended consequences or backfire. So I very much, I don't claim to speak for all human rights scholars, but I'm very much in the camp that local action and trying to look around us, I think we're best positioned to have the capacity to make change there.
Annie.
Hopefully this is an easy one. Are women generally more advocating for human rights than men, or no?
It's not an easy question. I'm not sure there's systematic data to answer that. I can't tell you percentages in any given country. I do know that men, women, transgender people of all genders advocate for human rights in all countries, and it's a pretty interesting question, but I'm not sure I can say that I've seen studies that document.
The reason I ask is because the reason I ask is the examples that you gave seem to be of women, so that's why I just wondered if there was.
That may reveal more about me and the sort of feminist gender studies lens that I put on all of this. And so the fact that there's not data that I'm aware of doesn't necessarily mean that it's not an empirical thing. I just don't think anyone studied that per se. But I think now that I understand the context of your question a little bit more, I would probably say, we need another lecture. I wouldn't want to say women are best positioned to do this work, because I think that's probably not true. And also, we need everybody. But I do think sort of feminine perspectives on politics may move us forward, or feminist perspectives on politics may move us forward in ways that are productive. And that might be why the examples look the way they look. Yeah.
How has the bootstraps mentality locally interfered with the movement forward with human rights?
The bootstraps?
Pulling yourself up by
your... Yeah. I just wanted to make sure I understand. Well, it neglects and disregards the structural nature of most human rights abuses. So, I mean, one of the things, too, human rights is an individual concept. Individuals have human rights. Groups do, too. But I think action on human rights absolutely positively requires thinking structurally. So it's too easy to say, if you rely on that sort of hyper-individualistic framework, which is how I think about the bootstraps, that it's not a rights denial if it's the individual's triumph, that they've managed to pull themselves up and the individual's fault if they haven't, we'll probably never get anywhere very far if we apply that framework. Now, I'm not making an anti-individual argument, because human rights are fundamentally about individuals in many respects, but individuals exist in communities and individuals live in structures. So structural inequality and oppression of all sorts absolutely affects the extent to which people are able to realize their rights. And if we pretend that's not true, we're not going to make progress.
You started that this is 70 years.
Yeah.
And looking back. So in the 70 years, what human rights have we seen the greatest gains in? And which ones have we struggled the most with? On a global perspective.
Yeah, so this is off-the-cuff answer, not... I'm a faculty member for a reason, so now I want to go see if there's a study. So my impression is this, my opinion, let's call it that, so that I'm not quoting a fact. I think probably one of the places, I'm relatively confident the more I think about this, the right to health, even though there's loads of limitations and imperfections, there have been vast improvements in health globally, and some of that is just development globally, but some of it is a result of the voluntarist, coordinated, and aspirational model of the United Nations. So I cited the figure at the beginning about 7 million preventable childhood deaths every year. Not so very long ago, that used to be 12 million, and the trend is downward. So global initiatives around vaccinations, for example, improved access to clean water, structural. It's like not about it. So addressing some of the structural things, health is improving globally in pretty much every region of the world. I think it's probably not going too far out on a limb to say that the rights that can be really stuck involve structural inequities. So gender-based violence, structural racism, those oppressions are really hard to change because of the structural nature and because of the way they're embedded in culture. So you really have to change culture. And changing structures is hard. I don't want to end on a depressing note, but I had a thought that I have to share. At a dinner party the other night, someone, it was after the Human Rights Conference, and some people that were there said, it's easier, we were talking about climate change. It's easier for many people to fathom the end of the world than it is to fathom the end of capitalism. And by the way, I'm not presenting a sort of knee-jerk ending capitalism would fix everything, because I actually think the spread of economic liberalism is part of why we've seen improvements in health globally. So there's a lot of tension around all of these things, but it's those structural things. Structural inequality is global, and it's huge, and so those things are really hard to change.
Seeing no more questions, Dr. DeLaet, it's been very informative, and thank you so much for your thought-provoking treatment of human rights tonight.
Yeah, thanks
we really
to all of you.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.